Break free from chronic depression, a pattern of unwanted thoughts and fears. Zen and Buddhist. The silent struggle of chronic depression. Depression is often misunderstood. It is not just a passing sadness or a response to a difficult situation. It is an internal storm. Relentless and isolating. Unlike physical pain, it does not leave visible scars. Yet its weight can feel heavier than mountains. For those who experience chronic depression, it is not just a fleeting moment of despair but an enduring mental state that clouds every aspect of life. In modern society, people often view depression as something to fight against, a battle to win. However, Zen Buddhism offers a different perspective. What if depression is not an enemy but a teacher? What if, instead of resisting, we learn to observe and understand our suffering? The path of Zen does not promise a cure, but it offers a way to live with peace despite the presence of depression. This article will explore a journey of self-discovery, revealing how the mind can transform suffering through understanding. It will integrate Buddhist wisdom with practical insights to help individuals find a path beyond the struggle. Part 1. The nature of depression. Seeing the mind as an ocean. One of the most powerful Zen metaphors is that the mind is like the ocean. Waves rise and fall, sometimes calm, sometimes turbulent, but no matter how fierce the storm, the deep waters remain untouched. Similarly, our thoughts and emotions come and go, yet our true self remains unchanged beneath them. Buddha once said, "Pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional." This means that while challenges and hardships will always be part of life, the way we experience them is within our control. Depression is not a sign of weakness but a state of mind that can be understood and softened. Observing the mind without attachment. In Buddhism, one of the key teachings regarding mental suffering is non-attachment. When we experience sadness, fear, or anxiety, we often identify with these emotions, believing that they define who we are. However, just as the ocean does not cling to its waves, we do not have to cling to our passing emotions. When a person is depressed, they may feel consumed by negative thoughts, as if drowning in turbulent waters. The practice of mindfulness and meditation helps us create space between ourselves and our thoughts. Instead of being carried away by mental storms, we learn to observe them with equanimity. A thought arises, and instead of resisting it or engaging with it, we simply acknowledge it and let it pass like a wave dissolving back into the sea. The impermanence of emotions. Depression often feels permanent, but Buddhism teaches the truth of impermanence. Just as the seasons change and the tides ebb and flow, our mental states are in constant flux. No emotion, no matter how intense, lasts forever. Understanding this impermanence can provide relief and perspective during difficult times. Imagine standing on a shore watching waves crash and retreat. When we see them as part of a natural cycle, we stop fearing them. Likewise, when we realize that depressive thoughts and emotions will eventually subside, we can cultivate patience and resilience instead of panic or despair. Compassion toward oneself. A key element in overcoming depression is practicing self-compassion. Buddhism teaches that suffering is universal. Every being experiences pain and struggle. Instead of judging ourselves harshly for feeling low, we can extend kindness toward ourselves, just as we would toward a friend in need. Metta meditation, or loving kindness meditation, is a powerful practice that involves sending goodwill and compassion to ourselves and others. By repeating phrases such as, "May I be happy," "May I be free from suffering," "May I find peace," we slowly transform our internal dialogue from one of criticism to one of care. Letting go of resistance. Consider a person lost in a storm at sea. The harder they fight against the waves, the more exhausted they become. But if they learn to float, the ocean carries them instead of drowning them. Likewise, understanding the nature of depression allows us to navigate it instead of being overwhelmed by it. Depression often worsens when we resist it, believing that we should not feel this way. But what if we allowed ourselves to sit with our emotions without judgment? Instead of fighting against sadness, we acknowledge it as part of our human experience. This does not mean resignation, but rather a gentle acceptance that allows healing to begin. Meditation as a path to inner stillness. One of the most effective tools in managing depression is meditation. In Buddhist practice, meditation is not about suppressing thoughts but about seeing them clearly and without attachment. Through mindfulness meditation, we train ourselves to return to the present moment instead of getting lost in past regrets or future anxieties. A simple breathing meditation can serve as an anchor in stormy times. By focusing on the inhale and exhale, we create a space of stillness within. This practice cultivates a sense of inner stability, reminding us that no matter how turbulent the surface waters, the depths of our being remain calm and undisturbed. Finding meaning through service. Another Buddhist principle that helps counter depression is selfless service, dana. When we shift our focus from our own suffering to helping others, we gain perspective and purpose. Small acts of kindness, whether volunteering, listening to someone in need, or simply offering a smile, create ripples of positive energy that can lift us out of isolation. Engaging in acts of compassion reminds us that we are interconnected with all beings. This sense of connection dissolves the loneliness that often accompanies depression. As Thich Nhat Hanh beautifully said, "Happiness is not an individual matter. When we have joy and peace in ourselves, we can offer them to others." Embracing the ocean of the mind. Depression, like waves in the ocean, will always rise and fall, but through mindfulness, self-compassion, and an understanding of impermanence, we can learn to surf the waves rather than be submerged by them. The journey toward healing is not about eliminating all suffering but about transforming our relationship with it. When we stop resisting the waves and instead move with them, we discover the vast, unshakable depth of peace within ourselves. Part 2. A story of seeking freedom, a man and the monk. There was once a man who lived entirely within the prison of his own thoughts. From the moment he awoke to the moment he closed his eyes, he was consumed by heavy emotions, endless worries, and self-doubt. His life felt like a river of darkness. No matter how hard he tried to swim, he remained stuck in the same place. Seeking relief, he turned to distractions, work, relationships, entertainment, but the silence of his own mind always found him when he was alone. One evening, feeling lost, he wandered through an ancient path and arrived at a monastery. There, he saw an old monk meditating peacefully under the moonlight. Desperate for answers, the man approached him. "Master," he said, "my mind is my enemy. It tortures me with fears I cannot silence, thoughts I do not want, and sadness that never leaves. I want to be free. Tell me, how do I defeat my mind?" The old monk opened his eyes and smiled. "You wish to defeat your mind?" he asked. "But who is the one that wishes to defeat it?" The man was confused. "It is me, of course." "And who is the me that suffers?" the monk asked. The man paused. He had never truly questioned it. "Come," the monk said, "I will not give you answers, but I will show you a path. Whether you walk it or not is up to you." The monk gestured for the man to sit beside him. The night was still, and the air was thick with the scent of blooming jasmine. The man, unsure but intrigued, followed. "Close your eyes," the monk instructed. "Observe your breath. Do not attempt to control it. Simply watch." The man obeyed. At first, his thoughts swirled wildly, trying to distract him. Worries about his job, his relationships, his future, they all screamed for his attention. He felt restless, impatient. "Do not fight your thoughts." The monk's voice came gently. "Simply watch them, as if they are clouds passing through the sky. The sky does not chase the clouds away, nor does it hold onto them. It simply allows them to come and go." The man continued. Slowly, something shifted. His thoughts no longer felt like chains binding him. Instead, they were merely passing through his awareness. He was not his thoughts. He was the observer. "Master, for a moment, I felt free," the man whispered. The monk nodded. "That moment of freedom is always within you. But you have spent your life identifying with your mind, believing it to be who you are. Your suffering is not caused by your thoughts, but by your attachment to them." The man frowned. "But my thoughts feel real. My fears, my regrets, they define my life. How can I just let them go?" The monk picked up a small cup and filled it with water. Then, he dropped a handful of salt into it. "Drink." The man took a sip and grimaced. "It is too salty." The monk then led him to a nearby lake. He took another handful of salt and dropped it into the water. "Now drink." The man hesitated but scooped up a handful and tasted it. The water was cool and refreshing. "I can barely taste the salt," he said. "Your suffering is like this salt," the monk explained. "The salt itself does not change. But your mind is like the cup or the lake. If your mind is small, even a little suffering feels unbearable. But if your mind is vast, suffering is diluted in the vastness of your awareness." The man sat in silence, contemplating. For years, he had been trapped in the cup of his mind, drowning in his own suffering. But what if he could expand his awareness, just as the lake expanded beyond the salt? "Master, how do I make my mind vast like the lake?" The monk smiled. "Through stillness, through presence, through letting go. Each moment you are aware of your breath. Each moment you observe without attachment. You are stepping beyond the prison of your mind." The man closed his eyes again, this time with a sense of purpose. He breathed in, deeply and fully, feeling the life force within him. He was not his fears. He was not his thoughts. He was something beyond them. Something vast. Something free. As the night deepened, the man remained there, sitting under the stars, beside the monk, in complete silence, and for the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to be truly free. Lesson 1. The River of Thoughts, Letting Go of Resistance. The monk led the man to a quiet stream. The water flowed effortlessly, carrying fallen leaves with it. "Do you see how the river flows?" the monk asked. The man nodded. "Now take this leaf and hold it in your hands." The man picked up a fallen leaf and gripped it tightly. "What happens to the leaf?" the monk asked. "It stops moving," the man replied. "And what happens if you let it go?" The man released the leaf, and it gently floated away. "Your thoughts are like this river," the monk said. "When you try to control them, gripping tightly, they become stuck. But when you let them flow, they pass on their own." The man frowned. "But my thoughts are not gentle leaves. They are heavy, painful, and relentless." "Then why do you hold on to them?" the monk asked. The man had no answer. This was the first lesson. Thoughts only have power when they are resisted. When allowed to come and go without attachment, they lose their hold. As the man sat by the river, the monk continued, "The mind is much like this water. When left undisturbed, it reflects the world clearly. But when you struggle against it, trying to grasp and control every thought, the water becomes turbulent, distorted, clarity is lost." The man took a deep breath. "But what if I can't stop my thoughts? What if they overwhelm me?" The monk smiled. "Imagine standing in this river, trying to push the water away with your hands. The harder you resist, the more forceful it feels, the more exhausted you become. But if you simply stand and allow the water to flow around you, you remain unharmed. Your resistance creates your suffering." The man lowered his gaze, contemplating these words. "So, if I let my thoughts come and go, they will not harm me?" "Exactly," the monk said. "A thought is only a thought, nothing more. It is like a bird flying across the sky. If you do not chase it, it simply passes. But if you attach to it, follow it, make it your own, you create stories, fears, worries. You trap yourself in illusions." The man nodded slowly. "But I have carried these thoughts for so long. Some feel like part of me. How do I truly let go?" The monk picked up another leaf and placed it in the man's palm. "Do not force yourself to let go. Instead, observe. See how the leaf naturally moves with the current. Allow your thoughts the same space. Witness them as an outsider. Do not grasp. Do not push away. Simply notice. Over time, their weight will lessen. This is the practice of mindfulness." The man watched the leaf drift away once more, something inside him loosening. "Is this what meditation teaches?" The monk nodded. "Meditation is not about silencing the mind. It is about understanding it, watching it without judgment, without control. Just as you do not command the river to flow, you do not need to force the mind to be still. It will settle on its own when you stop struggling." The man exhaled deeply, feeling the truth in these words. For the first time in many years, he sat in silence, not fighting his thoughts, not drowning in them, but simply allowing them to come and go like the river before him. The monk closed his eyes and said, "This is the way of peace, not the absence of thought, but the absence of attachment." The river continued to flow, carrying leaves upon its surface, just as the mind carried thoughts. And yet, beneath the movement, there was stillness, a stillness that had always been there, waiting to be noticed. Lesson 2. The Illusion of Fear, Facing Shadows. The man remained in the cave, his heart pounding in his chest. The darkness seemed to press against him, and the silence was deafening. At first, he struggled against his fears, trying to push them away. But the more he resisted, the stronger they became. The cave, though physically empty, became filled with shadows of his own mind, old regrets, painful memories, the weight of expectations, and a deep sense of unworthiness. He clenched his fists, his breath uneven. Every thought that surfaced felt like a monster lurking in the darkness, ready to consume him. His body trembled as his mind projected images of suffering, of failure, of being lost in endless despair. He wanted to call out for the monk, to run out of the cave, to escape, but the words of the monk echoed in his mind, "Face whatever arises." Taking a deep breath, he loosened his grip and allowed the fears to be. He did not suppress them, nor did he attempt to fight them. He simply observed, like a distant spectator watching waves rise and fall in the ocean. The shadows danced, they whispered, they screamed, but he remained still, unmoving like the mountain that housed the cave. As time passed, he began to notice something subtle yet profound. The more he sat with his fears, the less terrifying they became. His thoughts came and went like drifting clouds. They no longer held the power to consume him. He saw them for what they truly were, passing illusions, empty echoes of past experiences and imagined futures. Hours later, the monk returned, finding the man seated in deep contemplation. The once fearful expression on his face had softened, replaced by a quiet sense of peace. "What did you learn?" the monk asked. The man looked up, his eyes filled with newfound clarity. "At first, my fears overwhelmed me. They screamed and twisted my mind. But when I stopped resisting, they lost their power. I saw that they were like shadows, formless and fleeting. The moment I faced them, they began to disappear." The monk smiled. "Yes, fear is a creation of the mind. It exists only when you give it energy. The more you resist, the stronger it becomes. But when you turn to face it, when you sit with it, you realize there is nothing there but your own thoughts." The man nodded, feeling as if a great weight had lifted from his chest. "So, the key is not to fight fear, but to observe it?" "Exactly," the monk affirmed. "The mind is like a vast sky, and thoughts are like passing clouds. You are not the clouds, you are the sky. The moment you realize this, fear loses its grip." The man sat with these words, absorbing their truth. He understood now that fear was not an enemy to be vanquished, but a shadow to be illuminated with awareness. He saw how, for so long, he had been running from his pain, his doubts, his uncertainties. But true freedom was not found in escape. It was found in turning towards the very thing he feared and embracing it with courage and understanding. For the first time in a long while, he felt free, not because his fears had vanished completely, but because they no longer held him captive. He had learned to sit with them, to welcome them, and in doing so, he had discovered the profound truth the monk had been trying to teach him all along. Fear, like a shadow, has no substance of its own. It exists only in the absence of light, and when one chooses to turn inward, to observe rather than resist, the light of awareness dissolves even the darkest of illusions. Lesson 3. The weight of identity, letting go of the false self. The man stood silently, gazing at the bowl of water in his hands. The monk's words echoed in his mind. "Who are you, if not your suffering?" For years, he had believed his identity was built upon the burdens he carried, his past mistakes, his fears, the expectations others placed upon him. Each drop in the bowl represented a label he had accepted: successful, failure, loved, abandoned, strong, weak. He had never questioned whether he needed to carry them at all. With each step he took, the bowl felt heavier, though the weight had never changed. His arms ached, his back stiffened, and his breath became labored. But was it truly the bowl that exhausted him, or was it his resistance to releasing it? The monk watched in silence, waiting. Finally, the man spoke. "If I set it down, will I disappear?" The monk chuckled softly. "No, but what will disappear is the illusion you cling to." The man's hands trembled as he knelt and gently placed the bowl on the ground. He expected to feel empty, lost. Instead, a strange sensation arose within him: lightness. He took a deep breath, one that filled his lungs fully, as if he had been holding his breath for years. "I feel free," he whispered in disbelief. The monk nodded. "The self you have carried was never real. It was a collection of stories you told yourself, a mask crafted from past wounds and future fears. True freedom begins when you stop defining yourself by what has passed." The man sat beside the monk, watching the river flow. He had spent a lifetime resisting change, holding on to the past as if it could offer security. But the river had no need for such attachments, it simply moved forward, embracing each moment as it came. "What if I forget who I was?" the man asked. The monk smiled. "You cannot forget what was never truly you. The past may have shaped you, but it does not own you, just as the river does not cling to the rocks it passes. You are meant to flow, not to be trapped by what has already gone." The man looked at the bowl once more. It still sat beside him, unchanged. He could pick it up again if he wished, carry it as he always had, but now, he knew that he had a choice. He stood up, feeling lighter than he ever had before. The weight was never in the water. He murmured to himself, "It was in my mind." As he turned toward the path ahead, he did not pick up the bowl. He no longer needed it. The river continued flowing, and so did he. Conclusion: walking the path beyond suffering. Days passed. The man continued to sit with his thoughts, observe his fears, and release his identity. At times, his mind resisted, clinging to old narratives, replaying past wounds, whispering doubts about the path he was on. But he remained still, neither rejecting nor embracing those thoughts, simply watching, allowing them to arise and dissolve like waves upon the shore. One evening, as he sat beneath the vast expanse of the twilight sky, he witnessed the changing hues of the setting sun. The golden light faded into deep shades of crimson, then softened into the quiet embrace of night. In that moment, something shifted within him. His suffering had not disappeared, yet it no longer gripped him. His thoughts still came, but they no longer dictated his reality. His fears still murmured in the background, yet they lacked the power to bind him. A strange lightness filled his being, not a sense of euphoria, but the gentle realization that he was no longer weighed down by the illusions he had once taken as truth. Turning to the monk beside him, he spoke softly, "I feel lighter, but I do not feel different. My mind is still the same." The monk nodded, his expression calm as the surface of a still lake. "Your mind was never the problem. It was your belief that you were the mind that caused your suffering." The man's breath caught for a moment. A simple truth, yet one he had not fully grasped before. He had spent his life identifying with his thoughts, believing they defined him, believing that to be free, he had to change them, erase them, control them. But now, he saw. He was not his depression. He was not his thoughts. He was not his fears. He was the awareness that watched them rise and fall, the open sky through which they drifted like clouds, impermanent, shifting, ever-changing. In that realization, a profound stillness settled within him. He did not need to chase happiness, nor did he need to destroy suffering. Both were part of the human experience, arising and passing according to their nature. What mattered was his relationship with them. The tighter he held onto them, the more they defined him. The more he let them move freely, the less they controlled him. For the first time, he understood. Liberation was not about escaping suffering but seeing through its illusion. He stood up. The world around him remained the same. The wind still whispered through the trees. The stars still shimmered in the vastness above, and his thoughts still floated through his mind. But he was no longer trapped within them. And so, he walked away, not cured, not healed, but free.